pretty woman or an ugly reality? How Canada's new prostitution law changes the oldest profession.
The news traveled fast to every corner and street corner in Canada. Bill C-36, the new Canadian prostitution law, marks a seismic shift in Canadian law, and for thousands, the results could be life-changing. Coming up, we'll navigate the diverse views that led us here. In a moment, two MPs offer very different views on this polarizing new law. Later, you'll meet the instructor of a John's School, a remedial course for those caught buying the services of a prostitute. Up first, the law that changes the way Canada responds to prostitution.
Well, first a Supreme Court decision, then a new law, and it has forever changed our response to prostitution in Canada. You'll meet our guests in a moment, but first, here's Sheldon Neal with In 60.
Thank you so much, Lorna. In December 2013, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that criminal code offenses regarding prostitution were unconstitutional. The federal government was given 12 months to create a new law, and it responded with a game changer, Bill C-36, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. It's a tough new law that would, for the first time, make buying sex illegal in Canada. Prostitutes had and asked for the right to make a safe living from sex work, but the government said no and responded with a law that counters the social harm caused by the objectification of the human body and the commodification of sexual activity. Pro-prostitution groups are outraged at Bill C-36. Supporters welcome the new law and say it will help the most vulnerable victims in society.
Joining us from Ottawa are two MPs at the centre of the prostitution law debate. Conservative MP Joyce Smith supported Bill C-36 and championed its creation. NDP justice critic MP Francoise Boivin believes the new law is far from perfect. So, Joyce Smith, let's begin with you. The underlying goal of this law is to say Canada does not condone selling sex. And it's a moral game changer on how we've looked at prostitution. Why such a strong and historic stand?
It's very important because in this country we have victims who are trafficked every day, underage kids. We have young people and older people that are forced into the sex trade. What's so historic is that the first time in Canadian history, the purchase of sex will be illegal. For the first time in Canadian history, there is support for the victims of human trafficking and prostitution to get out. It's very historic.
Okay, Francoise, what are your primary concerns? You're the opposition's justice critic. What are your primary concerns with this new legislation?
Well, first of all, it's the buying of sex that is primarily illegal now, very clearly. That I must say to the government, this is clear. The selling isn't. Which in my mind creates a big problem in a sense that the government kept saying throughout the committee hearing that since the women, because it's mostly women who are in the sex trade, are victims, we didn't want to victimize them more, so we wouldn't make them criminals. But they have the right to sell, but nobody can buy. So there's a bit of a problem. I see the underground business of selling sex getting even more underground, and we have to go back to the reason behind C-36, which was, according to its title, to be an answer to the Bedford decision. Bedford decision from the Supreme Court of Canada in December of 2013 was all about safety and security for those who are doing that highly, highly risky business, but that our job as a legislator is to make sure that they are protected.
But Joy, that is the big critic of this bill. Mm-hmm. For all those who say, look, I'm not trafficked, I want to sell my body, this now makes their life more dangerous. What would you say?
In actual fact, what we're finding out right now is a lot of these victims are being controlled from inside by the pimps, by the Johns. The reason being, it's money. They make between $260,000 to $280,000 per victim per year. Right now, everything is stacked against those in prostitution, those who were trafficked into prostitution. They have, on one hand, the pimps and the Johns that threaten them. They have to say what the pimps and the Johns tell them to say. But you know, how you cut everything off, and it's been proven in Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, that if you target the Johns and the pimps, and if you make the buying of sex illegal, I know in Sweden after 2 years, 50% of the buying of sex, 75% actually, of the buying of sex stopped, and prostitution was cut by 50%.
Okay, I want to go to a voice of sad experience on this and then ask you to comment. Angel Wolf is an advocate for children whose mothers were murdered by the sex killer Robert Pickton. He was that notorious Vancouver killer of prostitutes. Angel Wolf presented her statement to the parliamentary committee studying this law, and she said, I believe Bill C-36 will save vulnerable people like my mom. I blame prostitution and addiction for my mother's death. On behalf of the 98 orphans, we do not want our mothers' deaths to be the reason prostitution is legitimized. So, Francoise, how I hear your concern for those who you don't want it to go more underground, but how does this now help a story like this one?
Well, I felt so, you know, everybody was really emotional when we heard all those stories because they are absolutely heartbreaking. And I was having a discussion with one of the policemen who came to testify in front of the committee. And in the cases, even the cases that Ms. Smith was talking about, where we know that there's people who are absolutely not doing prostitution on their own free will. This is a really slim percentage of the population who do so. But for the others, there's no real consent. So it already falls into sex exploitation and into human trafficking, which is not what Bedford decision was all about. So to think that C-36 will necessarily make it that situation that they were describing, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news. I do believe that to make such thing happen, you have, like they said, the people who were the proponents for the Swedish model, that you need to put a lot of money into making sure that the women who think that that's their only way out of poverty, of drug dependence, and you have to help these people. And everybody was unanimous in saying the government was not serious with its $20 million to do so. So there's so many tools already in place, so much more tools that we can give to our policemen, to our special workers in those fields, and to help these people to get out.
This is new, this new $20 million fund to get out. Joy, how will this bill help the vulnerable?
It'll help the vulnerable because for the first time, the buying of sex will be a criminal offense. That automatically shuts off a lot of things. And the inner story that we hear all the time about the victims who have to do as they're told, it is modern day slavery, of the victims who can't get out because if they try, they'll be beaten, they'll be held hostage, they'll be told what to do.
Conservative MP Joy Smith and NDP MP Francoise Boivin, thank you for joining us. When we return, moral opinion meets reality. Bridgette Perrier of Sex Trade 101 gives a voice to the women most affected by prostitution. And now a look at the heart of prostitution. Bridgette Perrier tells her remarkable story, but first, here's Sheldon with some fast facts.
Thank you, Laura. Dysfunctional family life, socioeconomic marginalization, abuse, isolation, and low self-esteem are all risk factors in entering prostitution. Many girls forced into prostitution by age 13 are victims of child abuse. First Nations women represent a disproportionately high number of street-level prostitutes. Most people purchasing sex are males in their late 30s, early 40s who are widowed, divorced, or separated with an income of more than $60,000. 78% of Canadians agree that girls under the age of 16 are not in prostitution by choice. A survey of 218 Canadian sex workers found the majority are comfortable in their work.
Our next guest is Bridget Perrier. She has sold sex in legal establishments, street corners, strip clubs, and for crews on cargo ships on the Great Lakes. Bridget is the co-founder of Sex Trade 101, a public awareness group of women in prostitution. Bridget Perrier, welcome to Context. Okay, Bridget, how did you get into sex work?
Well, I think it started at an early age. I was adopted into a non-Native family, so right there I suffered the effects of colonialism and being not the same race as my adopted family. And also I had endured child sexual abuse, which made me a perfect candidate for prostitution. On top of not fitting in racially and you know, being sexually abused, my parents didn't understand what was going on. They felt that because it was a good home, that I was acting out, and they placed me into Children's Aid, back to the care of the society. And from there, I was lured out of one of their girls' homes into prostitution.
So tell us your experience in prostitution.
My experience was, it was very hard. I suffered many years of indignity. I got lured out and worked for a woman who ran a legal establishment in Halifax, where I was flown out at the age of 12, 13 to this brothel, and where I worked and stayed with her and her kids.
At 13, you were flown to a brothel.
Yes. It was weird because I was told that if the police did ever encounter us, to just say that I was either a relative or one of her daughter's friends. So, and at this time, you got to understand, I'm a ward of Children's Aid. So, and you know, like not once was I ever asked flying if I had ID, who I was going to see. Not once was I ever even questioned.
Do you consider that trafficked?
Oh, I was trafficked. Definitely, I was trafficked. I was in my early 20s, and I found myself sinking into addiction and sinking into despair. I found myself actually incarcerated for prostitution-related offenses.
You testified before the Parliamentary Committee in favor of Bill C-36. Do you believe this bill will help women like you?
I think
like you were.
I think it will save women. I think that we need to look at the damage that men who pay for sex, what they do to prostituted women and girls. I think that our bodies aren't commodities, and there's a sacredness when it comes to sex, and it's totally not looked at. It's not enjoyment on the seller's behalf, it's enjoyment for the buyer. And these men do things with you that they wouldn't ask their wives to do. It's very degrading and humiliating. You have to gauge them. If their pupils are dilating, you know you're going to be in a fight. And I believe that prostitution is a form of paid rape.
Pay rape. Mm-hmm. Pay rape. Bridget, you also believe that God has walked into your experience of being a prostitute.
Well, I've been told I was bad ever since I was 11, 12 years old. And, you know, I believed it. And at one point, I was in isolation when I was incarcerated. And one of my children were dying. My son was dying, and that night God spoke to me, and he said to me that I was loved. And when I was feeling alone, that he was with me at all times, and to be quiet and to be still and to listen. And I shouldn't have went up for bail the next day, and I got released on bail because I believe that God had a plan for me.
God's really been a game changer for you. What do you say to somebody who's still stuck?
There's hope. No matter what, there's people out there that love you, and when you don't think that you're lovable, or anyone could love you, there are people. We at Sex Trade 101, we see our girls, our victims, as not victims, as survivors, and we believe they're viable human beings, and they have a right to have someone treat them with dignity and respect. And those women that are saying they choose to be in this type of work, we need to understand that word choice. When you have no choice and you're stuck in a situation, you have to say you're choosing it. It's a survival mechanism. I became a doormat for men, and to honestly say now that I know that this is now a problem that men need to fix, and with each other, and say, hey, I don't feel it's an appropriate thing to pay for sex.
Bridget, Sex Trade 101 is well publicized. It's on the internet, available, and it is just the beginning of how women can be connected for exiting the sex trade. Bridgette Perrier, thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome.
All right. And now we're going to shift our discussion to the perspective of the John, those who buy sex. In a moment, you'll meet a man who teaches about the repercussions of the sex trade. But first, here's a talk we had earlier with a John about the other side of prostitution.
In my adolescence, I paid for sex, even though it was a $10 spot to get a Playboy, or it was to get a video. I paid for sex early, and it didn't cost much, but I still put money out to buy sex at that point. And it spiraled, and it wasn't until I was in my mid to late 20s that I started frequenting strip clubs. It's remarkably broken. I don't know this person's name, they don't know who I am, and yet you find yourself just kind of involved with this person in this sexual way that has no interconnectedness emotionally or mentally. It's just, there's some money involved, and then that's it.
Well, on paper, Tony Schneir facilitates the Prostitution Offender Intervention Program for the Saskatchewan Ministry of Justice in conjunction with the Salvation Army in Saskatoon. In everyday vernacular, he teaches at a John school for customers just like the one you heard. Tony Schneir joins us now from Regina.
Hello,
Tony, we had that little look at a customer. Tell us who the Johns are. Tell us about the people who buy sex.
In my experience, Lorna, the gentlemen who buy sex range from 18 years of age to the oldest that we've had in our program here was 86. They come from a wide cross-selection of everyday life. They're professionals, they're white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, they're unemployed, they're students. They're really, in many respects, an average guy, quite unlike often our stereotype is.
What motivates them to want to buy sex?
Victor Malarick, in his book The Johns, and the research that he did, discovered that many Johns are uncomfortable in relationships and often seek out this because it's an easier way to go. Sometimes they're in need of power and control, and this provides a way for them to relate to females that gives expression to that. Oftentimes they've seen things portrayed in pornography that either their spouses or partners are uncomfortable with, or they want to act it out with someone else, and so they will choose to pay for someone.
Okay, now I want to ask you if you can set aside your role as a government worker at the John School and now put on the other part of your life, and that is you are a Christian counselor, a Christian marriage and family therapist. When working on these sexual addiction issues, you bring in the story of God. How does this work?
We know from some of the research that Patrick Carnes has done is that some of the core beliefs for men who are struggling with sexual addiction is that I'm basically a bad or unworthy person. I'm unlovable. If I have to depend on other people to have my needs met, then I'm sort of in trouble, and that sex is one of my most basic needs. And here I think is really where the gospel message becomes quite relevant to men who are struggling with sexual addiction, because it sort of answers those questions. It responds to those fears and those doubts and those anxieties that they have. And as they're able to move towards the gospel message, a message of love, of acceptance, that's not based on who they are or what they've done, but on the love of Christ, then some of those basic questions get answered in a way that makes acting out somewhat redundant, if you will.
So what would be your hope for people buying sex?
I think I would sum it up in the language of awareness. First of all, it would relate to awareness of their own brokenness and the reality that the gospel speaks to that. I think also a sense of awareness in terms of how to meet some of those legitimate needs that underline their behavior. Obviously, they find self-oriented ways of meeting those, and for them to find healthy ways of meeting legitimate needs, I think could be a really important case for awareness. And then lastly, I think it's really important for men to come to a place of realizing that it's not so much in terms of what they can take and receive, but rather it's in how they contribute and give to their communities, to their society, to the world in which they live, that oftentimes meets some of those deeper needs in a really important way.
All right. Well, Tony Schneir, Director of Counseling and Health Services at Briarcrest Seminary, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, when we come back, agree or disagree about Canada's new prostitution law, we'll circle the wagons around one universal taboo, and we'll reveal just what that is next. Well, regardless of where you stand on the debate over Canada's new prostitution law, everyone agrees that we must be united in our fight against human trafficking. Helen Swarn says our debate about prostitution in Canada is part of a bigger global picture on human freedom. Helen, welcome to Context.
Thank you very much, Lorna.
Last time we visited, in a long way, it was at your work in Cambodia when we went on the ground to see what happens when people are bought and sold against their will. Here you're back now saying, Canada, as you form this law, here's how your story fits into the bigger global picture of human trafficking. Explain.
Absolutely. Well, I think that what we need to do is we need to stand back and look at what is really fueling the issue of prostitution around the globe. The global statistics right now that have come out from recent research is somewhere between 21 and 30 million people a year are being trafficked in this world. This is a global criminal network. They know how to get people around the world. They know how to move children around the world. So if we don't tackle this with a common legal framework, we're not going to address it. So if we're looking at legislation here in Canada, we know that Canada is a destination country. Nobody wants vulnerable women and children to be trafficked. So we focus on the common ground. Coordination is critical. If we're going to see an end to this and we're going to find referrals and services for victims, we have to focus on coordinating those services. So if somebody is from Vancouver and they've been trafficked across to Montreal and they need to get back to Vancouver, the most important thing is finding services and safety nets for them when they go back. Okay. Now, this is what the registry will do. It will have service providers in there. And so you can begin to filter, well, I need a shelter in Vancouver for a 15-year-old girl. And you can start to link that immediately so that the victims get the services as soon as they need them.
Okay, so Helen Swarn, the Freedom Registry goes live in Canada shortly after the prostitution law is expected to be presented to Parliament. And already you can start the education process and the application process because it's a clearing. There's 6 criteria for any of the resources to go on this.
That's right.
Helen Swarn, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
As it's been said, the law is a teacher, and Canada's new prostitution law is meant to teach that buying sex is exploitive and violent and an expression of inequality. Not all agree, but that's what Bill C-36, the proposed law, is declaring. The example of Jesus is to care for the well-being of others, and Jesus chastised people for judging a prostitute and was instead a champion of her redemption. A divine response consistent to the brokenness in all of us. And if you'd like to learn more about Bridgette's organization, or if you are looking for a way out of prostitution, or you know someone who might want help, please visit the website sextrade101.com, and there's more information on our website about how to get that help as well, contextwithlorna.com. We've left links to help you explore the views heard on the program today. All right, for all of us, I'm Lorna Duick. Thank you for watching us, and join next week as we explore life beyond the headlines.